don't know if I've told you all this before, but my older sister is actually a genius. Um, and the literal kind, not like, we all kind of think our older siblings are geniuses, right? But my older sister is a literal genius. She skipped second grade, and then she could have gone to college when she was 16, except for the fact that my mom didn't think that she should go to college at 16. And so following her was kind of an interesting thing. And my dad is also pretty close to a genius, if he's not as well. He made one A- in seminary. And so following them, it just always was very hard to be as perfect and academic and smart and studious as they were. And so I found that we have one of two options. I had one of two options. About third grade, when I realized that I would never be as smart as my sister, when I was like actually on track to graduate in the right amount of time, I kind of gave up, because I thought that even though I was smart enough to get through, I knew that I was never going to skip a grade and I was never going to be valedictorian. And so I just kind of signed it in or phoned it in. And I knew that I should work harder to be better, but I just felt kind of like, well, what's the point at this point? I know that I'm not going to skip a grade, and I know that I could never live up to her legacy. And probably those of you who have older siblings have that same kind of feeling, or you may have that same kind of feeling of your older sibling is always the one that kind of sets the pace and paves the way for you. And maybe it wasn't academics, but maybe it was sports. Maybe they were more athletic than you, or maybe they were more led people or treated people better than you. Maybe they were a better cook than you. Maybe it was something completely different. But maybe it wasn't even your sibling. Maybe there's some only children out here. Maybe it wasn't for you, the older sibling, but maybe it was someone else in your life that you knew that you couldn't quite, or you felt like you couldn't quite live up to. Maybe it was someone who's just kind of a step ahead. They got married first, they got kids first, bought a house first, got a job first, and somehow you kind of found yourself trying to live up to how they lived their life, and always kind of falling short of where they were. And pretty soon it's kind of tempting. It's tempting to give up. It's tempting to say that since we're not the best, so we might as well be last. And this, in fact, is what the problem of perfection is. The problem with perfection isn't that we can't achieve it. It's that oftentimes we burn ourselves out with trying, and so we just end up not trying at all. And as Methodists, we believe that it is possible to live to be perfect as Christ is perfect, and it's probably not probable. It's probably not probable that we will ever end up being perfect, and maybe it's not even likely, but we do actually believe that it's possible. And it's a frightening thought. We want to know what it takes to get there. What does it actually look like to be perfect and to live in perfection as Christ is perfect? Does it take being nicer than we were yesterday? Does it take cussing less or serving more? And we oftentimes want this list of things that we can check off so that we know that we are just as perfect as Christ is perfect. And even if we had that list, even if that list were possible, we would soon find ourselves falling short and struggling to keep up. And it's why I find so comforting that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said once that while he believes perfection is possible, he doesn't know anyone who successfully has. Here is the man who is such a fervent and faithful man of God that he met weekly with his peers to talk about giving to the poor and to kind of test each other out about giving to the poor. And he asked everyone to kind of pour over their sinfulness in all those ways that he's fallen short of the glory. And they read the Bible. He read the Bible daily, and then they read it together. They attended to it through writing commentaries, and he wrote tons of sermons. And yet, even though he did all of that all the time, he still said that he wasn't perfect. He was just working through it. And long time ago, before we even had Christianity, there once was a time where there wasn't only the belief of perfection, there was the expectation of it. There was this list of rules to which Jews were expected to abide, and your adherence to those rules defined not only your perfection, but how faithful of a God follower you were. And while Wesley tells us that he never knew anyone who achieved perfection under Christ, we get a completely different story from this man named Saul. You see, Saul made it very clear that perfection was possible under the law. He believed that perfection was possible under the law, and in fact, he himself calls himself perfect and blameless. And there really is no reason not to believe him. You see, he was a Pharisee, a man committed to following the law to a T. It was quite possible that he not only would have known every word of the law, but he actually would have abided by it. Except that there was one major glaring problem with Saul, as we will recall. He was against the followers of Jesus. We hear this story of Saul in Acts 9. It says this: "Meanwhile Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' He asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' The reply came, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.'" So yes, Saul was perfect by the law. He made no mistakes by the law, except that there was this one glaring problem. He would go out and he would threaten people of the way, and the people of the way were the followers of Jesus, kind of our modern day Christians, and he mocked them and he spoke against them and he threatened to bound them and capture them and bring them to trial, to murder them. You see, Saul was perfect, or so he thought. And yet, he was in fact the farthest thing from perfection possible. You see, Jesus spells out clearly that there's only one unforgivable sin, and that unforgivable sin is blasphemy. He says this in Matthew 12:31. Any sin shall be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Spirit shall not be forgiven. At this point in the story, in this point in Matthew, Jesus was speaking directly to the Pharisees, who were telling people that the miracles that Jesus performed were actually performed by demons. In other words, they saw the work that the Lord was doing, and they spoke against that work. And then Jesus, in response, says, "This is the unforgivable sin." But this is exactly what Saul was doing. He was speaking out against those people who were the earliest followers of Christ. He was telling them that what they were doing was wrong, and in so doing, he was actually speaking out against Jesus and the Holy Spirit. He was blaspheming. He was perfect and blameless according to the law, but he was doing the one thing we are told not to do. And so, one day on the way to Damascus, Jesus Christ, the risen Jesus Christ, appears to Paul. You see, for all that speaking against Jesus that he was doing, he was actually doing a good job. He was fervent and passionate against Jesus, the same way that Jesus wants us to be fervent and passionate speaking about him. And so Jesus appears to Paul, and Paul then falls to his knees, repents, and starts following Jesus. And he turns that passion and fervor that he once had against Christ into that passion and fervor to Christ, for Christ. What happens is he uses this major imperfection, this imperfection that he was speaking against Jesus, and he uses that to go out into the world and tell others why they should be following Jesus as well. In fact, there are many times throughout Paul's letters that Paul says, "Look, I was perfect and blameless by the law, but I still had nothing until I had Jesus." In Paul's imperfection, Paul was called to lead the early church, and he planted churches for both Jew and Gentile. And his message was spread out not only throughout those churches, but was so prevalent that today we still carry it in our Bibles. All because Paul was perfect and blameless in the law, except for that one imperfection, that he wasn't. You see, it didn't matter what Paul did. It mattered who Paul followed. it makes me wonder how often we hide our imperfections when they could actually be our strengths to the gospel of Christ. After all, have you ever noticed how many stories in the New Testament are really about broken people? The blind man who Jesus healed, the leper who Jesus cured, the woman at the well whom Jesus softly rebuked, the tax collector with whom Jesus had dinner, and then finally the robber with whom Jesus was hanged. And what do these stories have in common? They are stories of imperfect people made perfect by following Jesus. So often we want to be perfect in the eyes of others. We want to have the best family, the best cars, the best house, the best crops, the best job, the best everything. And it gets so exhausting to keep up. And the weird thing is, it's exhausting for others as well. Others that are looking at us, wondering if they will ever be as perfect as us. And in fact, what it does is it strips our power to help others. Have you ever messed up in your life so badly and you go to someone else and they said, "Oh yeah, I've never done that." You probably didn't go back to them for advice the second time. Or have you ever messed up in your life so badly and gone to someone else and they said, "Oh yeah, I've done that before. I know exactly how that feels. Here's how I got through it." Chances are that second person is the one that you went back to for advice the next time. The same thing happens when we talk to others about our faith. When we put on the mask of perfection, we're closing ourselves off to the conversation with others about faith. I was at High Point University on Tuesday night. Some of you already know this story, but I was at High Point University on Tuesday night for an interfaith dinner. It's Ramadan and the Muslim faith, and so they were having an interfaith dinner with Muslims and Christians and atheists. And there were about 75% students there, 20% professors and staff, and then myself and the chaplain there. And after the dinner finished, a young woman caught up with me to talk about spirituality. And when I say that she caught up to me to talk to me about spirituality, it was a very colorful conversation. She had grown up in the church in a very conservative congregation, and she was frustrated about many things in the church. She described all of her frustrations with it, and I would quote you, but I don't think that it's appropriate for me to quote what she said in church. She didn't have a very high opinion of church, and she didn't have a very high opinion of Christians, and yet she told me that she still believes in God, that she still has faith in God, and that she just doesn't really know what she believes. And there were many things that she said that night, many things that I hope that I get a chance to work with her on later, but the one thing that struck me was her frustration with how many Christians act like they have it all together. She complained about social media presence that boasted the Christian life, and she complained about friends who wore their Christianity on their sleeve, and this general attempt to have our Christian lives completely together. And she said this to me. She said, I get that some people are genuine about it. I get that some people have that passionate fervor, she said. But there are so many people who are doubting their faith and are afraid to just say so. If someone would just tell me this is how they worked through that lack of faith, I just may actually believe again. You see, your lack of perfection could be what someone needs to find God's perfection. Through all of your attempts to try and be perfect, to try and act like you have this Christian thing put together, we could be pushing someone away from the one who is perfect. You see, it's okay to not have it all together. It's okay not to be perfect, and it's okay to know that God's grace is what covers you. It's okay to say, I'm not perfect, but I know the one who is. But mostly we can learn from Paul that all of the perfection in the world doesn't matter if you aren't going to go out and start spreading the truth of Jesus Christ to others.